Okay. In chapter 3 of Romans, verse 20, God says, "For no human being will be justified in his sight by works of the law." But the question is that the moral law, or the ceremonial law, or the Ten Commandments, for example, specifically in the moral law? Well, that's the question. What St. Paul says earlier on, here we are, just find the relevant verses. Okay, Romans 2:13, he says, "For it's not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but the doers of the law who will be justified." So I just read you a verse which said, no human being will be justified in his sight by works of the law. But before that, just a chapter before that, Paul says, it is the doers of the law who will be justified. So there's immediately something interesting. Then we go, I'm jumping around chapters 2 and 3 here, to emphasise this. Chapter 3, verse 20. Oh, so I got to that, sorry. Verse 28. That's right. St. Paul says, "For we hold that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law." So at that statement, Paul says, you're not justified by works of the law. So the question is, what are you justified by? And he answers the question in verse 28 of chapter 3. Justified by faith apart from works of the law. So I put to you that when Paul says law, he means different things at different times. Otherwise, a man of great intellect will be contradicting himself within chapter. It just doesn't make sense. What he's saying is, when he says the doers of the law will be justified, he's talking about the moral law, because he goes on to say it, verse 14 of chapter 2, when the Gentiles who have not the law do by nature what the law requires, they are a law unto themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that what the law requires is written on their hearts. That must mean, Paul means the law written on their hearts is a ceremonial law. Is the moral law. It can't be the ceremonial law, because they wouldn't have that written on their hearts. And they're Gentiles, they wouldn't know that, only Jews would know that. So when he talks about doers of the law, he's talking about doers of the moral law. But when he says, no human being, later on in the next chapter, no human being will be justified in God's sight by works of the law, that must be referring to the ceremonial law, because I've established that in the previous chapter, he's said you can be justified by the moral law. Now, when he goes on to say, in verse 28 of chapter 3, "For we hold that a man is justified by faith, apart from works of the law," by faith. That means that those who come into a knowledge of Christ must have faith in order to be justified. A rejection of Christ will mean that no matter what works you do, you will be damned, you will not be saved, you will not be justified, and therefore will not be saved. So only Gentiles who do not know Christ can be spoken of as possibly being justified by the works of the law. But the Catholic position would be, as I understand it, because you need to come into the family of God, which is the church, before the end of your life, you must be justified by faith. You must become a person of faith, and God will get faith to you. God will present you the information you need to be a faith-filled person, even at the last moment of your life. Thus you can enter into the church, the family of God. All right, so that's saying then that the Protestant view, hold on, Victor, the Protestant view that you are justified by faith alone is wrong. And to say that Paul is ruling out works for justification is also wrong,